gunshot that killed Diana Hart's father didn't just take his life, it took her laughter with it, stolen by men who couldn't stand to see a woman inherit land they believed belonged only to those cruel enough to claim it. Vulture City, Arizona, sprawled across the desert landscape like a collection of sun-bleached bones in 1882, a place where gold fever had cooled, but greed remained hot as the summer stones. Diana stood at 22 years old in the parlor of the small ranch house her father had built with his own weathered hands, staring at the deed that made her the sole owner of 300 acres and the modest cattle operation that came with it. The lawyer who delivered the papers looked at her with something between pity and doubt, his expression saying what his mouth wouldn't dare speak aloud in a room full of witnesses. Women didn't run cattle ranches. Women didn't survive alone in country this unforgiving. Her Aunt Miriam clutched her hand during the reading of the will, whispering prayers under her breath that did nothing to fill the hollow space where joy used to live. Diana hadn't smiled in the 3 weeks since they buried her father on the hillside overlooking the property. She hadn't laughed in longer than that, not since the threats started coming, not since the Garrett brothers made it clear they wanted the Hart land and didn't care what methods they used to get it. James Hart had been a good man in a place where goodness often got you killed. He'd stood firm against the Garretts when they tried to buy him out at a fraction of what the land was worth. He'd refused their intimidation, their poisoned cattle, their cut fences. He'd kept standing until the bullet found him on a dusty road 3 miles from home, fired from a distance by a coward who disappeared into the desert before anyone could give chase. The sheriff investigated for exactly 2 days before declaring it unsolved, and Diana knew why. Frank and Samuel Garrett had half the town in their pocket, and the other half was too scared to speak against them. The funeral had been well attended despite the fear. Her father had friends, good neighbors who respected what he'd tried to build. But friendship didn't translate to protection, and respect didn't bring the dead back to life. Diana stood beside the grave in a black dress that trapped the heat against her skin, and she felt something inside her close up tight like a night-blooming flower at dawn. The part of her that used to find light in small things, that used to laugh at her father's terrible jokes, that used to sing while hanging laundry, simply stopped. It was as if those men had killed that part of her along with killing him. Now she sat alone most evenings, going over the ranch accounts by lamplight, trying to figure out how to keep the operation running with the 2 remaining ranch hands who'd stayed on out of loyalty to her father's memory. She knew they wouldn't stay forever. She knew the Garretts were waiting, watching, expecting her to fail so they could swoop in and claim everything during a forced sale. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders until she felt like she might sink right through the floorboards into the earth below. Autumn came to the Arizona desert with subtle shifts in temperature, the brutal summer heat giving way to days that were merely hot instead of murderous. Diana rode out to check the water sources, her father's old hat shading her face, her rifle across her saddle even though she'd never been much of a shot. The land rolled away in all directions, dotted with mesquite and palo verde, cut through with dry washes that would run briefly when the winter rains came. It was beautiful in a harsh way. This country that demanded everything from those who tried to live on it. Her father had loved it. She wasn't sure what she felt anymore. The drifter showed up on a Tuesday morning in October when Diana was attempting to repair a section of corral fence that had come loose. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. Too many things had gone wrong lately to trust a stranger's approach. He rode a paint horse with a calm, steady gait, sitting easy in the saddle like a man who'd spent most of his life there. As he drew closer, Diana could make out details: tall, lean build, dark hair that needed cutting, a face weathered by sun and wind but still young, probably no more than 26 or 27. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, nothing fancy, everything showing the kind of wear that came from actual use rather than affectation. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startling clear blue against his tanned skin. "Morning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a politeness that seemed genuine rather than mocking. "Name's Dalton Murphy. I'm looking for work. Heard in town there might be a ranch out this way that needed hands. Diana's jaw tightened. You heard wrong. I've got the men I need. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Two men couldn't properly work a spread this size, and from the way Dalton Murphy's gaze traveled over the ranch, taking in the repairs that needed doing and the general air of things falling slightly behind, he could read the situation as clearly as she could. Respectfully, miss, it doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting. His voice carried no challenge, just statement of fact delivered in a low, warm tone that reminded her oddly of her father. I'm good with horses, decent with cattle, and I can fix just about anything that breaks. I'm not asking for much, just fair wages and a place to sleep. I can't afford to take on another hand right now, Diana said, which was closer to the truth. Money was tight, especially with the loss of cattle to the Garrett's sabotage earlier in the summer. Dalton considered this, then nodded slowly. What if I worked the first month for just room and board? Give you a chance to see what I can do, and if I'm worth keeping on, we can talk wages then. She should have said no. She should have sent him on his way, because getting attached to people, letting anyone new into her life, felt like inviting more loss. But there was something in his face, an openness and honesty that she hadn't seen in a long time, and the practical part of her brain that sounded like her father's voice whispered that she genuinely did need the help. 1 month, she said finally. You pull your weight and cause no trouble. We'll talk about making it permanent, but I'm not making any promises. The smile that crossed Dalton's face was small but genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. That's all I'm asking for, Miss Hart. You won't regret it. She showed him to the small bunkhouse where the other two hands, Old Joe and Miguel, slept on narrow cots. They greeted Dalton with the wary friendliness of men who'd seen too many drifters come and go to get excited about a new face. Diana left them to get acquainted and walked back to the house, aware of a strange flutter of something in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Not hope, exactly. Maybe just the smallest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Dalton proved himself in the first week. He rose before dawn and worked until dusk, attacking the backlog of repairs with an energy that put the other hands to shame. He rebuilt the section of fence Diana had been struggling with, then moved on to fix the barn door that had been hanging crooked for months. He had a way with the horses that bordered on magical calming even the most skittish mare with soft words and patient hands. Diana found herself watching him from the house windows more than she cared to admit, studying the efficient way he moved, the care he took with every task. He didn't talk much at first, which she appreciated. So many men felt the need to fill every silence with words, but Dalton seemed comfortable with quiet. When he did speak, it was usually to ask a question about how she wanted something done or to offer a suggestion in a way that never sounded like he was questioning her authority. There was a respect in how he treated her that felt foreign after months of men looking at her like she was playing at ranching, like she was a child pretending to be an adult. 2 weeks into his stay, Diana was working in the small vegetable garden her father had helped her plant, trying to coax the struggling plants through another season. The shadow that fell across her made her look up to find Dalton standing there, hat in his hands, looking uncertain for the first time since he'd arrived. Sorry to bother you, Miss Hart, but there's something you should know about. Her stomach clenched. What is it? Found fence cut on the eastern boundary this morning. Fresh cuts, done sometime last night from the look of it. Lost about 20 head of cattle through the gap before I could get it closed up. Diana stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, feeling that familiar cold dread settle in her bones. The Garretts. Dalton's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. I heard some things in town about them. Are they the ones who've been causing problems? They want this land. They wanted it when my father was alive, and they want it more now that I'm alone. The words came out flat, emotionless, because she couldn't afford to feel the anger and fear that churned beneath them. They figure if they cause enough trouble, I'll have no choice but to sell. And if you do sell, it'll be to them at whatever price they name, Dalton said, understanding flashing in those blue eyes. That's a coward's game. Something in the way he said it, the genuine disgust in his voice, made Diana's chest tighten. There's not much I can do about it. The sheriff won't help, and I can't watch every mile of fence every night. Maybe not alone, Dalton said quietly, but you're not alone anymore, are you? Not completely. She wanted to argue, to tell him not to get involved because getting involved with her problems seemed to have fatal consequences. But the words stuck in her throat as she looked at him standing there in the afternoon sun, his expression serious and determined. When was the last time someone had stood with her instead of backing away? That night, Dalton and Miguel rode out to patrol the fences while old Joe stayed close to the house. Diana paced the parlor, unable to settle, jumping at every sound. She must have looked at the clock 100 times before she finally heard horses returning around midnight. Dalton knocked softly on the door, and she opened it to find him looking tired but unharmed. "Everything's quiet," he reported. "We'll keep writing the lines at night, different times, so there's no pattern to predict. Make it harder for them to know when they can make a move." "You don't have to do this," Diana said, and hated how her voice wavered slightly. "This isn't your fight." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them in the lamplight. Something unspoken but powerful. "I think it is now," he said simply. "Get some sleep, Miss Hart. We've got early morning coming." The attacks continued but grew less successful with Dalton's vigilance. He seemed to have an instinct for where trouble might come, positioning himself in the other hands in ways that prevented the worst damage. But the attempts took their toll in other ways. Everyone grew tired from the interrupted sleep and constant tension. Diana found herself drawn tighter and tighter, waiting for the next crisis, the next loss. It was Dalton who seemed to notice how the strain was affecting her. She was in the barn one evening, checking on a mare who was due to foal soon, when he appeared in the doorway carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering one. "Miguel made it, so I can't promise it's any good, but it's hot." Diana accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around it even though the evening was warm. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the mare shift and settle in her stall. "She'll be a good mother," Dalton said eventually. "You can tell by how calm she is. Some mares get nervous before foaling, but this one knows what she's about." "My father bought her 3 years ago," Diana heard herself say. "Said she had good bloodlines, that her colts would be worth something. He was always thinking ahead like that, planning for futures he didn't get to see." Dalton's voice was gentle when he spoke. "He built something good here. Anyone can see that. And he raised a daughter strong enough to keep it going. That's a future he's seeing through you." The words shouldn't have hit her as hard as they did. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple kindness in his tone, but Diana felt something crack inside her chest, some piece of the wall she'd been hiding behind. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "I feel like I'm drowning and everyone's just watching from the shore." "That's because you're doing the swimming all by yourself," Dalton said. "But you don't have to. I meant what I said before. This is my fight now, too. Theirs, too." He nodded toward the bunkhouse where old Joe and Miguel were settling in for the night. "You've got people standing with you, Diana. You just have to let us." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. She looked at him in the barn's dim light and saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. There was care there, genuine care, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to this place to me? You've only been here a few weeks." Dalton set his coffee cup on a shelf and turned to face her fully. "Because the first time I saw you, you were trying to fix that fence all by yourself, and you looked so determined, so fierce, even though I could see how tired you were. And I thought, there's a woman who won't quit, who'll fight for what's hers until there's nothing left to fight with. That's worth standing beside. You're worth standing beside." The air between them felt charged, electric. Diana's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. She didn't know how to respond to such plain honesty, such unvarnished declaration. Men didn't talk like that. didn't look at her like that, like she was something precious and strong at the same time. "Dalton," she started, but didn't know how to finish. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "I know this probably isn't the right time," he said quietly. "I know you're dealing with more than enough without me adding complications, but I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. However long it takes to deal with the Garretts, however long you need, I'll be right here." Diana's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of day-old stubble under her fingers. The gesture surprised them both. She'd been so closed off for so long that physical contact felt foreign. But with Dalton, it felt natural, right? "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to let anyone in when everyone I've let in gets hurt." "Then we'll figure it out together," Dalton said, covering her hand with his own. "One day at a time. No promises about forever, just about showing up tomorrow and the day after that." She wanted to kiss him. The urge surprised her with its intensity, but before she could decide whether to act on it, the sound of rapid hoofbeats outside made them both turn. Miguel appeared in the barn doorway, his face tight with worry. "Riders coming. 5 or 6 of them heading straight for the house." Diana's blood turned cold. She grabbed her rifle from where it leaned against the wall and followed Miguel outside, Dalton right behind her. Old Joe was already positioned on the porch, his own rifle ready. In the distance, she could see the dust cloud raised by approaching horses, moving fast in the twilight. The Garrett brothers led the group, Frank on his big bay stallion and Samuel on a flashy sorrel. 4 men rode with them, hired guns by the look of them, hard-faced men who wore their weapons with easy familiarity. They pulled up in the yard, horses dancing and snorting, stirring up more dust. "Evening, Miss Hart," Frank Garrett called out, his voice carrying false pleasantness that made Diana's skin crawl. He was a big man in his 40s, running to fat but still powerful, with mean little eyes that never matched his smile. Lovely night for a visit. "State your business and leave," Diana said, keeping her voice steady even as her hands tightened on the rifle. She stood on the porch with her men flanking her, 4 against 6, not the worst odds but far from good. Samuel Garrett, younger and meaner than his brother, leaned forward in his saddle. "Our business is simple enough. You've been playing at ranching long enough, girl. It's time to be realistic. Your daddy's dead. You can't run this place, and you're hemorrhaging money trying. We're prepared to make a final offer, $500 for everything, the land, the buildings, the cattle. That's more than generous considering the state of things." "The state of things you've caused?" Dalton said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The cut fences, the poisoned water, the rustled cattle. We all know who's behind it." Frank Garrett's eyes shifted to Dalton with cold assessment. "Don't recognize you, boy. You're new." "New enough," Dalton agreed, "but I've been around long enough to know extortion when I see it." The air felt dangerous now, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Diana could feel violence hanging over them, ready to fall. Her finger rested near the trigger of her rifle, and she knew everyone else's did too. $500 is an insult," Diana said, forcing strength into her voice. "This land is worth 20 times that at least, and you know it. I'm not selling, not now, not ever, certainly not to you." Frank's false pleasantness dropped away, revealing the ugly truth beneath. "You're making a mistake, girl. A bad one. Things can get a lot worse for you than they already are. You might want to think about that before you get stubborn." "That sounds like a threat," Old Joe said from his position on the porch. "Might want to be careful making threats with witnesses around." "Witnesses?" Samuel laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Who's going to testify? You, old man? These drifters? Everyone knows how things work out here. Accidents happen, people disappear, ranches burn." Diana felt Dalton tense beside her, felt the moment when he decided he'd heard enough. He stepped forward, off the porch, moving into the yard with a loose, ready stance that said he knew how to use the gun on his hip. "Here's how this is going to go," Dalton said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made even the hired gun sit up straighter. "You're going to turn those horses around and ride out. You're going to leave Miss Hart and her property alone, and if anything happens to this ranch, if one more fence gets cut or one more cow goes missing, the law will know exactly who to look for." "The law?" Samuel sneered. "The sheriff doesn't care what happens out here." "Maybe not the county sheriff, Socialist," Dalton agreed. "But there are federal marshals who care quite a bit about property rights and intimidation tactics. I wrote one just yesterday, as a matter of fact. Old friend from my time working security for the railroad. He takes a special interest in cases like this." Diana's breath caught. She didn't know if Dalton was bluffing, but it didn't matter. The Garretts didn't know either, and she could see the calculation happening behind Frank's eyes. Federal intervention was a different matter than local corruption. "You're making an enemy you can't afford," Frank said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I've had worse," Dalton replied. "Now ride out. This is private property, and you're not welcome." For a long, breathless moment, Diana thought it would go bad. She could see Samuel's hand twitching toward his gun, could feel the violence ready to explode. But Frank, with the cooler head of the two brothers, pulled his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah, it is, Dalton said. "You just don't know it yet." They watched the Garretts and their hired guns ride away into the gathering darkness. Diana didn't lower her rifle until they were out of sight, and even then her hands were shaking. "Did you really write to a federal marshal?" she asked Dalton. He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Not yet. But I will tomorrow, and I wasn't lying about knowing one. Sometimes a bluff is as good as the real thing if you sell it right." Miguel let out a long breath. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest." "Probably some of both," old Joe said, lowering his rifles, "but it bought us time. The question is what we do with it." They gathered in the house, lighting lamps against the dark, and discussed their options late into the night. Dalton made good on his promise immediately, writing a detailed letter to a Marshal William Crane in Tucson, outlining the harassment and intimidation Diana had suffered. Miguel volunteered to ride into town at first light to post it. Old Joe suggested they document everything that had happened, create a record that could be used as evidence if needed. Diana sat at her father's desk, watching these men work to protect her and what was hers, and felt something stirring in her chest that she almost didn't recognize. It took her a moment to name it because it had been gone so long. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but there nonetheless. When the others finally headed to the bunkhouse for what remained of the night, Dalton lingered. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands, looking at Diana with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You should get some sleep," he said gently. "So should you." "I will. Just wanted to make sure you're all right first." Diana moved toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name, didn't want to name because naming it made it real and real things could be lost. "I'm not all right," she said honestly. "I haven't been all right in a long time, but tonight, with you standing there facing them down, I felt like maybe I could be all right again someday." Dalton reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "You're stronger than you think, Diana. You've been fighting this battle alone for months, but you're not alone now." "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Really?" His answer was to lean down and press his lips to her forehead, a kiss that was tender and sweet, and promised nothing but gave everything. "Because when I look at you, I see my future. Because you're worth fighting for. Because I think I've been riding toward this ranch, toward you, my whole life without knowing it." Diana's eyes burned with tears again, but this time she let one fall. "I don't know how to do this. I've forgotten how to be anything but afraid and angry." "Then let me remind you," Dalton said. "Let me show you that there's still good things in the world, still reasons to smile." She didn't smile then, couldn't quite manage it yet, but she let him hold her, and that felt like a beginning. The days that followed were tense but quiet. The Garretts seemed to be holding back, maybe spooked by the mention of federal marshals, maybe planning something bigger. Dalton worked the ranch during the day and wrote out detailed accounts of everything that had happened in the evening, building their case. Diana found herself watching him constantly, drawn to the calm competence he brought to everything he did. He started finding small ways to make her life easier. He'd leave wildflowers on the porch step in the morning. He'd take on the tasks he knew she hated most without being asked. He'd tell stories during dinner that were actually interesting. Tales from his time working ranches from Montana to New Mexico, delivered with a dry humor that occasionally pulled something almost like a smile from her. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Miguel returned from town with a letter. Marshal Crane had responded, and he was taking the matter seriously. He'd be in Vulture City within the month to investigate the complaints. Furthermore, he'd already sent word to the county sheriff that federal eyes were now on the situation, which should encourage proper local law enforcement. "This changes things, Gigits," old Joe said, reading over Diana's shoulder. "The Garretts can't operate in the open now, not with a marshal coming." "Which might make them more dangerous," Dalton said quietly. "Desperate men do desperate things." He was right. 2 nights later, Diana woke to the smell of smoke. She stumbled from bed, heart racing, and looked out to see flames licking at the barn. She screamed for the men and ran outside in her nightgown and bare feet, not thinking about anything but the horses trapped inside. Dalton reached the barn first, throwing open the doors, disappearing into the smoke. Diana's heart stopped. She could hear the horses screaming inside, could see the flames spreading. Miguel and old Joe were running with buckets from the well, but the fire was already too big for buckets to matter. Then Dalton emerged, leading the pregnant mare, his shirt pressed over his mouth, his eyes streaming. He handed the lead to Diana and plunged back inside. He made trip after trip, bringing out horse after horse until all 6 were safe. The barn was fully engulfed by then, the heat so intense they had to back away. They stood watching it burn, knowing there was nothing to be done but let it go. Dalton collapsed onto his knees in the dirt, coughing, his hands and face covered in soot. Diana dropped beside him, her hands frantically checking him for injuries, for burns, terror making her movements clumsy. "Are you hurt?" "Dalton, look at me. Are you hurt?" He shook his head, still coughing. "I'm fine. The horses?" "All safe, thanks to you." Her voice broke. "You could have died. That barn could have come down on you and you could have died." "But I didn't." He looked at her with those impossibly blue eyes now red from smoke and grabbed her hands. "I didn't, Diana. I'm right here." She kissed him then desperately, tasting smoke and fear and relief all mixed together. His arms came around her, pulling her close despite the watching eyes of the other ranch hands, despite the barn still burning behind them, despite everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Diana realized she was crying. "I can't lose you too," she said. "I can't. Everyone I care about gets hurt or killed, and I can't survive that again." "Hey," Dalton cupped her face in his blackened hands. "Hey, look at me. I'm not going anywhere. You hear me? I'm not leaving you." "You can't promise that." "Watch me. I'm promising it right now. Whatever comes, we face it together and we both come through the other side." Old Joe cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We should probably check the perimeter. Whoever set this might still be around." They found the evidence easily enough, oily rags stuffed against the barn's back wall, the smell of kerosene still hanging in the air. It was arson, plain and simple, and everyone knew who was responsible. This time, Diana rode into town herself the next morning, marching into the sheriff's office with Dalton at her side, demanding action. Sheriff Tompkins was a weak man who'd grown comfortable looking the other way. He shifted uncomfortably behind his desk as Diana laid out what had happened, showed him the oily rags they'd collected as evidence. "Now, Miss Hart, you can't prove the Garretts had anything to do with this. Who else would it be?" Diana's voice was cold with fury. "They've been terrorizing me for months and you've done nothing. But there's a federal marshal coming to town in a few weeks, and when he gets here, he's going to hear all about your inaction. He's going to hear about how you let criminals operate freely while you sat in this office collecting your salary." The sheriff's face reddened. "You're making serious accusations." "Yes, I am. and I'll make them to Marshal Crane's face when he arrives. You still have time to do your job, Sheriff? I suggest you start." They left him sputtering behind his desk. Word must have spread quickly because that afternoon the sheriff actually rode out to the Garrett Ranch. Diana didn't know what was said, but the harassment stopped. Completely. No more cut fences, no more missing cattle, no more nighttime visitors. "They're scared," Dalton said. "They know they've gone too far, and they're trying to lay low until the heat passes." "Will it work?" Diana asked. "Not if we keep the pressure on, not if we make sure Marshal Crane hears everything." The barn's loss hit hard financially and practically. They needed shelter for the horses and a place to store feed and equipment. Dalton organized a barn raising, calling in favors from neighboring ranchers her father had befriended over the years. Diana was shocked when nearly 20 people showed up on the designated Saturday, bringing lumber and tools and food. These were people she'd barely seen since the funeral, neighbors who'd seemed to abandon her when she needed the most. But as they worked side by side building the new barn frame, she understood. They hadn't abandoned her out of lack of caring. They'd been afraid of the Garretts, afraid of what helping her might cost them. But with a federal marshal taking an interest, suddenly it was safe to be her friend again. She should have been bitter about that. Part of her was. But mostly she was just grateful to see the barn taking shape, to watch her community come together, to feel less alone than she had in months. Dalton worked alongside the other men, his shirt off in the November heat, muscles moving under sun-browned skin as he hauled beams and hammered nails. Diana caught herself staring more than once, caught other women noticing her staring and smiling knowingly. Let them smile. She was beyond caring what anyone thought. At midday, the women laid out a feast on makeshift tables. Roasted chickens, fresh bread, 3 kinds of pie, jugs of cold lemonade. Everyone gathered in the shade to eat and talk and laugh. Diana found herself sitting between Dalton and Mrs. Chen, whose husband ran the neighboring ranch to the west. "Your young man did a brave thing saving those horses," Mrs. Chen said, her English carrying the accent of her native Guangdong. "My husband says he is a keeper." Diana felt her cheeks warm. We're not." Mrs. Chen patted her hand with a knowing smile. "He watches you like my husband used to watch me when we were young. Like you are the sun and he is the flower turning to follow your light. That is how I know he is good man." Across the gathering, someone had brought out a fiddle. Music started bright and lively, and despite everything, despite the ashes of the old barn still visible behind them, people began to dance. Diana watched them spin and laugh, feeling strangely disconnected, like she was looking at joy through thick glass, able to see it but not feel it. Dalton appeared in front of her, hand extended. "Dance with me." "I don't dance," she said automatically. "I don't believe that for a second. Come on." She let him pull her to her feet and into the informal dancing area. His hand settled on her waist, warm and steady, and they began to move to the fiddle's bright tune. Diana felt clumsy and awkward at first, too aware of eyes watching, of her own stiff movements. But Dalton led with patient confidence, and gradually she began to relax into the rhythm. "There you go," he said softly. "See? You remember how?" "My father taught me," Diana heard herself say. "When I was little, he'd dance with me in the kitchen while my mother played the piano. Before she died, before it was just the two of us. He sounds like he was a good father. The best." Her throat tightened. "He didn't deserve what happened to him." "No, he didn't, but he'd be so proud of you, Diana, of how you fought to keep his dream alive." The song ended and another began, slower this time. Dalton pulled her closer and she let him, resting her head against his shoulder. They swayed together, and for just a moment, Diana let herself feel safe. Let herself imagine a future where she wasn't constantly afraid, where she could stand in the sunlight and dance without looking over her shoulder for danger. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Dalton said quietly, his lips close to her ear. "I think I have been since the first day I rode onto this land. I know that's probably too fast, too much, but I don't want to hide it. Life's too short and too uncertain to pretend I don't feel what I feel. Diana's heart hammered against her ribs. She should pull away, should protect herself, but instead she tightened her arms around him. I'm terrified, she whispered. I'm terrified of how much I need you, of what it would do to me if something happened to you. Then we'll both be terrified together. But we'll also be together, and that makes all the difference. She lifted her head to look at him. This man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared speak. I think I'm falling in love with you too. I think I'm so far gone I don't know how I'd function without you anymore. His smile, when it came, was bright as the Arizona sun. Good. Then we're on the same page. He kissed her there in front of everyone, a proper kiss that left no doubt about their feelings. Someone whistled, and laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was warm laughter, approving. When they finally broke apart, Diana felt dizzy and breathless and more alive than she'd felt in months. The barn raising continued into the evening, torches lit as the sun set, everyone determined to get the structure completed. By the time the last nail was driven, stars scattered across the clear desert sky. The new barn stood proud and strong, built by community and determination, a symbol of something the Garretts couldn't destroy. People began packing up to head home, calling out goodbyes and good wishes. Mrs. Chen pressed a basket of food into Diana's hands with instructions to eat properly and take care of herself. Others made similar gestures, small offerings that added up to something bigger: acceptance, friendship, solidarity. When the last wagon had rolled away, Diana stood with Dalton looking at the new barn. I can't believe they came. I thought everyone had written me off. People need permission to be brave sometimes, Dalton said. The marshal taking interest gave them that permission. But they wanted to help all along. I could tell from how they talked about your father in town, about you. They just needed to know they wouldn't be standing alone. I was so angry at them for not helping sooner. That's fair, but maybe consider forgiving them anyway. Holding on to anger is like holding on to hot coals. You're the one who gets burned. Diana leaned into him, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, but also feeling lighter than she had in ages. When did you get so wise? I've made every mistake a man can make. Wisdom is just accumulated stupidity if you're lucky enough to survive it. She laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it was a laugh. The first real laugh she'd managed since her father's death. Diana froze, surprised by the sound coming from her own throat, surprised by the way it felt in her chest, like something loosening. Dalton heard it too. She could tell by the way he went still, by the expression on his face when he turned to look at her. Wonder and joy and something so tender it made her eyes sting. What was that? He asked softly. I don't know. Diana pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beating beneath her palm. I haven't. It's been so long since... Diana, you laughed. Did you hear yourself? You laughed. The enormity of it hit her like a physical force. She had laughed. The part of her that had shut down after her father's murder, that had closed up tight against all light and joy and simple happiness, had cracked open just enough to let a laugh escape. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it felt monumental. I thought I'd forgotten how, she whispered. Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. You didn't forget. It's still there, all of it. The laughter, the joy, the ability to find light in dark places. The Garretts tried to kill that in you, but they failed. They couldn't touch it because it's too much a part of who you are. Diana clung to him and cried, but these tears were different from all the ones before. These were tears of release, of healing, of something frozen beginning to thaw. She cried for her father and for herself, for all the months of fear and anger and desperate loneliness, and Dalton held her through all of it, steady as stone, warm as fire. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, the night was full dark around them, the stars brilliant overhead. I want to try again, she said. Try what? Laughing? Being happy? Living instead of just surviving? She looked up at him. This man who'd brought light back into her shadowed world. I want to try with you. Diana Hart, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want a future with you if you'll have me. I'm saying yes to whatever this is between us and to whatever comes next. Dalton's grin split his face. I'll have you. I'll have you from now until the end of my days if you'll let me. I'll help you run this ranch. I'll stand beside you against anyone who tries to take it, and I'll spend every day trying to make you laugh until it comes as easy as breathing. He kissed her again, sweet and deep and full of promise. And this time when they broke apart, Diana was smiling. Really, truly smiling. Her face felt strange forming the expression, muscles unused to the movement. But it felt good too. Right. Marshal Crane arrived 3 weeks later, a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. He spent 2 days interviewing everyone involved, examining the evidence, riding out to look at cut fences and the location where Diana's father had been killed. The Garretts had clearly been expecting him and tried to play innocent, but too many people came forward with stories now that they had the law's protection. The marshal arrested Frank and Samuel Garrett on charges of intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit arson. He couldn't prove they'd killed James Hart, not without more evidence than the circumstantial connections, but the charges he could make stick were serious enough. The Garretts would face trial, and even if they somehow avoided conviction, their power in the region was broken. Everyone had seen them arrested, hauled away in irons. The myth of their invincibility died that day. Diana stood on her porch and watched the marshal ride away with his prisoners, and felt like she could finally breathe fully for the first time in months. It was over. The nightmare that had started with her father's death was finally over. What do you think? Dalton asked, standing beside her. Can we make this ranch something special? We already have, Diana said. But yes, I think we can make it even better. He proposed properly a week later, going down on one knee in the new barn with a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Diana said yes before he'd even finished asking, and they were married 2 months later in a small ceremony in town with their ranch hands as witnesses and what felt like half of Vulture City in attendance. The marriage license listed them as Dalton Murphy, age 27, and Diana Hart Murphy, age 23. Diana kept her father's name as part of her own, a way of honoring his memory while building something new. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper all these years, and carried wildflowers that Dalton had picked that morning. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, someone in the back coughed nervously. Everyone turned to see a man Diana didn't recognize standing awkwardly in the doorway. I'm not objecting, he said quickly. I just thought you should know. Frank Garrett just died in jail while awaiting trial. His heart gave out. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Samuel Garrett was still in custody, but with Frank dead, the threat was further diminished. Diana felt she should feel something about the news, but all she felt was a distant relief. Frank Garrett had tried to destroy her life and had failed. His death was just the final punctuation on that chapter. Thank you for letting us know, she said calmly. Now, I believe we were in the middle of getting married. Laughter broke the tension, and the ceremony continued. When Dalton kissed his bride, cheers erupted, joyful and loud. Diana kissed him back and laughed against his lips, that sound coming easier now, more natural. She'd laughed dozens of times since that first small laugh weeks ago, each one a little victory against the darkness that had tried to consume her. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food and drink flowing freely. Someone played the fiddle while others danced. Diana danced with her new husband, with old Joe, with Miguel, with neighbors and friends. She danced until her feet hurt and her face ached from smiling, and it felt glorious. Late in the evening, as the party wound down, Dalton pulled her away from the crowd. They walked up the hillside where her father was buried, standing together in the moonlight before his simple headstone. I wish he could have been here, Diana said quietly. I wish he could have known you. could have seen that I'm going to be all right. I think he knows, Dalton said, and I think he'd approve of us. I'm going to take care of his daughter and his ranch and his legacy. That's a promise. Diana rested her head on his shoulder, looking out over the land that had cost so much but meant so much. He'd like you. He'd like that you make me laugh. They stood there for a while longer, then walked back down to their home hand in hand, ready to start their life together. The years that followed brought challenges, as all lives do, but Diana and Dalton faced them as a team. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing to 400 acres when a neighbor sold them adjoining land. Their cattle won prizes at regional fairs. Their horses became known for quality throughout Arizona territory. Samuel Garrett was convicted and sentenced to 15 years for his crimes. By the time he was released, broken and old before his time, Diana and Dalton's position was so secure that he was no threat. He left Arizona and was never heard from again. Diana gave birth to their first child in the spring of 1885, a boy they named James, after her father. The labor was long and difficult, and Dalton paced the porch for hours until old Joe finally told him he was wearing a groove in the wood. When Diana's Aunt Miriam finally emerged with the baby, Dalton's hands shook as he held his son for the first time. "He's perfect," he said, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He looks like you," Diana said from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "Same eyes." 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Rose. She had her mother's determination and her father's easy humor, a combination that promised trouble as she grew. Then came another boy, Samuel, followed by twin girls, Catherine and Margaret. The house rang with childish laughter and occasional tears with the chaos of a growing family. Diana watched her children play in the yard where she'd once stood facing down the Garretts, and marveled at how completely life had transformed. The woman she'd been, silent and grim and barely surviving, seemed like a stranger now. She still had hard days when she missed her father so acutely it hurt to breathe. But those days were outnumbered by good ones, by moments of such pure joy she felt like her heart might burst. Dalton was true to his word, spending decades making her laugh. He told terrible jokes, played elaborate pranks on the children, and could always coax a smile from her even on her worst days. He worked the ranch with dedication and skill, turning it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. But more than that, he loved Diana with a constancy that never wavered. Through good years and bad, through health and sickness, through everything life threw at them, on their 20th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and rose. Their children were grown or nearly so, James already working the ranch alongside his father, Rose planning to attend normal school in Phoenix to become a teacher, the younger ones still in various stages of childhood. "Do you ever regret it?" Diana asked, her hand in Dalton's as they rocked slowly in matching chairs. "Stopping here that day instead of riding on?" "Not for a single second," Dalton said. "This life, this family, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I'd live it all again exactly the same way just to end up right here." "Even the scary parts, the Garretts, the fire, all of it?" "Even that. Because those hard times taught us what we were made of. They showed us what we could survive together. And they make the good times sweeter by comparison." Diana smiled, that expression coming so naturally now she didn't even think about it. "You know what I remember most clearly from those early days? The exact moment I laughed for the first time after my father died. You made some silly joke about accumulated stupidity, and it just bubbled up out of me before I could stop it. I'd been so certain I'd never laugh again, that those men had killed that part of me along with killing him, but you brought it back. You brought me back." Dalton raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You were never gone, Diana. Just hidden for a while, protecting yourself. But you were always there, waiting for a safe moment to emerge. You made it safe. You and your stubborn refusal to leave even when it was dangerous, even when the smart thing would have been to ride on and find an easier life somewhere else. There's no life easier or better than one lived with the person you love, Dalton said. That's something I learned here, with you. Their children called them in for dinner, the big table crowded with family, laughter bouncing off the walls. Diana looked around at the life they'd built together and felt her chest swell with gratitude. She'd survived the darkness and found the light again. She'd been silenced by those who hated joy, but she'd rediscovered her laughter with the help of a cowboy who'd refused to let her face the world alone. Years continued to pass, bringing changes as they always do. Old Joe passed away in his sleep at 83, having spent his final years bouncing grandchildren on his knee and telling embellished stories of the old days. Miguel eventually married a widow from town and started his own small ranch with Dalton and Diana's help and blessing. New hands came and went, but the ranch remained strong. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Diana at 52 stood with her family to celebrate. The wild, lawless territory of her youth had become something more civilized, for better and worse. There were automobiles in Vulture City now, electricity in some buildings, talk of telephone lines. The world was changing rapidly, but the land remained constant, still demanding everything from those who worked it, still rewarding those who persevered. Diana and Dalton grew old together, their hair silvering, their movements slowing, but their love never diminishing. They sat on their porch most evenings, watching sunsets they'd seen thousands of times but never tired of, holding hands and talking or simply existing in comfortable silence. "Do you remember the night you told me you loved me?" Dalton asked one evening when he was 71 and Diana was 68. "After the barn raising when you laughed for the first time?" "I remember everything about those days," Diana said. "How could I forget? That was when my life really began, when I stepped out of the shadow and back into the light." "You were always the light," Dalton said, "even when you couldn't see it yourself." They had grandchildren now, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch passing to James, but remaining a family operation where everyone pitched in. The house Diana's father had built had been expanded and updated but retained its essential character. The land he'd loved and died for continued to prosper. On a warm spring day in 1923, Dalton didn't wake up. Diana found him in their bed, his face peaceful, his hand still stretched toward her side as if reaching for her even in death. The grief that crashed over her was immense, but it wasn't the destroying kind she'd experienced when her father died. This was clean grief, sad but not bitter, acknowledging loss while also celebrating the extraordinary gift of 40 years together. They buried him on the hillside next to her father, and Diana stood between the two graves with her children and grandchildren surrounding her. "He was the best man I've ever known," she said simply. "He saved me when I was drowning, and he loved me every day of our life together. I was blessed to have him." Diana lived another 7 years, watching her great-grandchildren grow, continuing to manage the ranch accounts even when she could no longer ride the property. She spent her final day surrounded by family in the house she'd fought so hard to keep, at peace with her life, and ready for whatever came next. When she died in her sleep at 75, they buried her between Dalton and her father, 3 souls who'd loved each other across life and death. The headstone read simply, "Diana Hart Murphy, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She found her laughter again." The ranch continued through subsequent generations, remaining in the family as Diana had always wanted. Her descendants told stories of the grandmother who'd fought off the Garretts, who'd kept the land when everyone said she'd fail, who'd found love with a drifter cowboy and built something lasting from adversity. But the story they told most often, the one that became legend in the family, was about how their grandmother had lost her laughter to those who hated joy, and how their grandfather, a man with clear blue eyes and a patient heart, had loved her so completely and so well that he brought her joy back until she laughed again. And once she started, she never stopped, filling the ranch house with laughter for the rest of her days. That was the real legacy Diana and Dalton left behind. More valuable than land or cattle or money, They left proof that even the deepest darkness could be overcome. That love was strong enough to heal the worst wounds, that joy could be rediscovered even when it seemed lost forever. They left a story of two people who found each other when both needed finding, and who built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And on quiet evenings when the desert wind blew soft across the Arizona landscape, people swore they could still hear laughter echoing across the Hart Ranch, the sound of a woman who'd reclaimed her joy and never let it go again.